Also on the call from Wolters Kluwer will be Lynn Reinheimer, Manager of ComplyTrack Editors and Sales Engineers. Before we begin today's webinar and introduce our featured speakers, I just want to cover a few quick housekeeping items. Since all participants will be muted during the presentation, please use the Q&A menu bar located on the GoToWebinar on the right hand of your screen to submit any questions. What we will do is be addressing these at the end of the presentation, so I hope you stay around for that session. If we're bumped up on time, what we will do is answer all questions via email that we don't get to. Now, there are 3 ways to download the presentation today. One came with your reminder email this morning. The other is you can go to the GoToWebinar chat box as you see on the screen, and also in the handout box on your screen. Today's webinar has been approved for 1.2 hours units from the HCCA. An email with a survey and downloaded instructions will be sent within 24 hours of the completion of the webinar. And now I'd like to introduce today's speakers. Richard Cousireau, CEO of Strategic Management Services. Mr. Cousireau served 11 years as the Inspector General for the Department of Health and Human Services. And prior to becoming Inspector General, Mr. Cousireau served 11 years in the Federal Bureau of Investigations as a Special Agent and Supervisor. Our next speaker will be Emil Masella, JD, Senior Consultant at Strategic Management Services. He has over 40 years of experience in the fields of corporate compliance, criminal investigations, and law enforcement, and provides advisory services to clients on compliance-related problems and issues. So with that, I'd like to turn the presentation over to our speakers.
As that Dick Cousireau started off and kind of set the stage for what we're trying to achieve today. First of all, this is just going to be an introductory course. It's not designed to turn people into professional investigators or really to take them much past knowing exactly how to proceed when you have an internal investigation, sort of the do's and don'ts of it. To be a fully qualified federal investigator, for example, you'd spend months of training either at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center or at the FBI National Academy. Both Emil and I have taught at the FBI National Academy to FBI agents, and needless to say that the level of training is far more detailed and sustained in terms of detail than what we have given you today. But hopefully what we can do is give you some general principles that will guide you and help you when you have an need for an internal investigation. The problem for most organizations, the larger the organization, the more likely you are to have a need for conducting an internal investigation. The smaller, the less likely that you're going to have one at any given period of time. What that means is that those organizations that are smaller may only rarely have something that really calls for a full investigation, and that is what the seed of the problem is for a lot of organizations, and they just don't have people who are prepared to do what is necessary when these occurrences come about. So the topics that we cover today are really going to define what investigations are, reasons why you would be conducting them, who would be the ones that would do it, how to go about planning it, how do you go about selecting an investigator, go into a little bit about how to go about conducting investigative interviews, then also the interview report, and then also the full case report itself. The thing is that an investigation really is, and it could be actually an investigation, you can almost sometimes just substitute the word inquiry, but basically what it is a detailed, systematic search to uncover facts to determine the truth of the situation. It's usually what we talk about the reporter questions: who, what, when, where, why, and how. It is really an integral part of the internal control system, and it's a process for self-assessment. It really involves expertise, capabilities from a variety of parties within an organization. The monopoly on conducting internal investigations certainly are not with the compliance office. Actually, HR does probably more in what would qualify as an investigation than any of the other categories, but it also can include internal audit, legal counsel, sometimes privacy and security officers. There are things that you should have in place to avoid confusion at the of a need for an internal investigation. Most organizations that do not have written policy guidance on this stuff will wind up with a problem of looking a little bit like Keystone Cops, and that is people bouncing around, each of them feeling they had jurisdictional rights, such as HR bumping into compliance or compliance bumping into legal counsel, and so on. We put up here some examples of these kinds of policies that should be in place, but there are many others that really relate to conducting internal investigations, including such things as what is your protocol for between the compliance office and legal counsel, or compliance office and HR, or other functions. So if the more you do in preparing in advance for an investigation, the better position you are in when actually a situation comes up that requires one. So the big question is, why do you need to conduct an internal investigation? Well, basically you must act on any violation, alleged violation of law and regulations, but also internally any violation of policies, code, issues. You want to ensure compliance, and to do that you have to do the investigation when there's a question that something has gone astray. You need to establish fact and evidence for making the right decisions in a variety of situations, and that is done by fact gathering. You need to conduct internal investigations to limit or to prevent potential liabilities. Sometimes the worst decision you can make is not making a decision and not promptly investigating, in which case things do not get better, they generally get worse, and liability or potential liabilities grow. Also, there are requirements for self-disclosures when in fact potential violations of law or regulations occur. And then finally, really, an internal investigation is a sound business practice. You should do that because you really need to know what's going on in your own environment. It also provides a factual basis for where you may want to have a need for changing a policy, procedures, a code, or to take corrective action measures. For example, you may have through conducting investigations, you may determine that you need to have certain improved training in certain areas, or development of new management controls, or also how you go about handling administrative and disciplinary action. And also what it does is that it helps you in terms of understanding how you're going to have to respond to regulatory enforcement agencies under certain conditions. As to who does conduct internal investigations, I already mentioned earlier, it certainly is compliance officers, but certainly HR as well. HR, when you have an issue of harassment in the workplace, or discrimination, or complaints about how an employee is being treated by the supervisor, those are HR issues, and that they get involved with us on a daily basis. With the growth of the HIPAA and privacy and security arena, more and more situations are arising that we need to, where you need to investigate where you've had a protected health information has been breached in one way or another. Legal counsel certainly has a role, particularly where there is a potential violation of law. They also, other than that, they should be available as advisors to an investigation if it begins to have complex problems associated with, like, interpretation of rules or regulations. Sometimes you'll have the chief financial officer or internal audit will be conducting what would qualify as an investigation, a fact-finding effort that's been organized. Risk management may, in fact, be conducting what could rise to what somebody would call an investigation, and safety officers as well. The big point here is that, for example, when Emil and I will go in to provide a real training program, in-depth training program for organizations where we have 5 times or 6 times or 10 times more slides than what you're going to see today, then we usually suggest that you invite all these actors to the table so that they can begin to appreciate what, in fact, an investigation is all about. The planning and scope of an investigation is really critical. That if you need to be able to set the investigative priorities and objectives at the outset, and if you don't do that, you could be just wandering around the wilderness, and you could have a lot of problems occur as a result of that. Also, there has to be a determination of who the deciding authority is. And you're conducting an investigation, who's going to receive that report, and who's going to be responsible for acting upon the results of that report. That needs to be done up front. If you conduct an investigation, these things, you have to try to sell the investigation to somebody to make a decision. That's not a good way to proceed. Also, to identify who is going to be doing the investigation is very important. Are they properly qualified? There should be some sort of briefing session so everybody's on the same wavelength as to what it is that they're going to be doing to resolve the fact situation that's in question. You really need to review what is known at the time of the decision to make an investigation. You need to identify those that you think are going to have to be interviewed during the course of the investigation to obtain a better understanding of what the true facts of the situation were. You need to find out what documents you need that would support the investigation, the outcome of the investigation. And then also, quite frankly, you need to really think about what is prompt in this case. How soon do you have to have something done? When do you need to complete the investigation? And then you need to have a discussion of how the report should be developed and presented. In executing an investigative plan, it's really important that you keep these principles in mind: timeliness, efficiency, thoroughness, objectivity, and that it be done lawfully and according to approved rules, regulations, and your policies and procedures. There needs to be information control. And information and evidence gathered must be managed so that you're on a need-to-know basis. There's nothing worse than to have the rumor mill pick up on pieces of an investigation that's going about, and boy, that can really pollute an investigation if people start beginning to talk about an investigation and develop their own hypotheses about what really occurred or what's really happened and so on. And therefore, you should be very, very careful that you do not have information about an investigation go astray. It must be controlled. It's also critical that you work with copies and not original documents. Original documents should be under lock and key. Work only with copies of documents. And then also maintain what we refer to in law enforcement as a chain of custody for all evidence. That nothing gets out of your control, that it's all under your control thoroughly. In terms of selecting investigators, you need to have somebody who understands basic principles of conducting an investigation and the practice and techniques of going about doing the work. They should have some training and ability and experience necessary for whatever tasks are being assigned to them. They need to really also understand the organization that they're part of, their programs, the activities and functions, so they understand the context by which they're going to be conducting the investigation. And of course, they need to be aware of applicable laws, rules, policies, regulations, and practices. They also have to have certain analytical skills in order to be able to properly evaluate the facts, to draw some sound conclusions, and to make some constructive recommendations at the end of the investigation. And also, the next point is really important. They need to have some interpersonal skills. They need to be able to talk to people, gather information from people, and gain their confidence and support. Then they also have to have the skills to deliver concise, factual summaries of the results of the inquiry that can be presented orally or in writing. The professional guidelines are just laid out here as bullet points. They need to be thorough when you do your investigation, compliant with applicable laws, rules, and regulations. They must be respect. You must show respect to everybody and respect their privacy. You've got to be impartial. You're going to be objective about your work. The reports must be supported by facts either to prove or disprove whatever the allegations or complaints originally set forth. They must be timely. They must be promptly conducted, reported, and as I mentioned earlier, delays really may aggravate circumstances greatly. And it has to be appropriate. You've got to follow your own procedures and as well as the applicable laws and regulations. So again, going back to having proper policy procedures in place to give guidance are really important when conducting an investigation. And of course, you have to meet the independent standard, which means you have to be, whoever's doing the investigation, it really has to be free from anything that might impair their impartiality in the way they go about doing their work.
All right, Dick, thank you very much. Let's move on to, I'm going to pick up on a notion that you just talked about, and that is the need for interpersonal skills. That comes to the forefront in particular during the process of interviewing. And so we're going to talk about an interview is a conversation with a purpose to learn about a person or what a person may know. From my contacts in the FBI, I understand that some of these skills are not as prevalent as they may have been years ago, only because we are communicating more with email, 140 characters, and similar types of devices, so that person-to-person types of interactions are giving way to this more digital world. That being said, we're still going to need to use the interview as the most important part of your the tools that you have for interviewing people. and part of that we'll talk a little bit more, that as you'll find out, people who have information will be drawn against providing information based on things like loyalty to a particular individual, sympathies that they may have for that individual, or even an empathy that they may have for a particular individual's circumstance. Types of interviews. I'm on slide 15. We've categorized these according to victims, complainant debriefings, witness interviews are going to be different, and suspect or subject interviews are going to be even more difficult and different from the other two. The witness interviews are going to be probably the largest part of the interview regimen that you'll get involved with. These are people who saw what happened. They may not have direct knowledge of what happened, but they can provide sort of collateral information. These are people who know something, so they provide a truly information base that you may take additional action on. Of course, expert witnesses. A lot of cases, it's statistical people in the type of work that we are involved with. Good interviewers, slide 16, will build rapport with the individuals that they're interviewing. You have to listen and concentrate on what's being said. I've always been taught, and I think it's a truism, that you learn more by listening than by talking. As attorneys, sometimes we fall short in that area because we get paid by the word. That's obviously you need to be polite. We're looking for individuals with good physical appearance. Keep judgments to yourself during the interview. Maintain eye contact with the person that you are talking to. Control your emotions. Don't get angry. And this gives you an opportunity sometimes to deflect anger with empathy. Understand why their personal situation led them to do what they did. And by doing that, you will draw more information out than if you became judgmental about what they were doing. Be flexible in your approach, but persistent. And you can also express verbal or nonverbal concern, either through your hands, or facial expressions, your posture in your chair. All these send signals as to how you are receiving that information. Like anything else, we like to identify the goals and objectives for each interview. Basically, you've chosen a person or persons to be interviewed for a reason. They know something that you don't, and you need to extract that information from them. Step 2 is to review available information resources. Review the available information and resources. Look at the allegations predicting the investigation. And don't dismiss allegations because a person has a particular axe to grind. We see that often, that people decide to make the allegation, and there is some allegation of an animus between the person who's coming forward and the possible target of the investigation. That very well may be true, and it may affect their credibility, but it also may be exactly the right information, the correct information, and factually true. We may have a prior history with people, so look at results of previous inquiries on related subjects. Review the laws and policy, code regulations, union contracts. understand what the particular element of the violations that you're looking at. Some of these actually may change from company to company. In conflict of interest, for instance, where an individual may be taking action, official action, and there's a personal gain. Sometimes that personal gain extends beyond the individual to family, friends, and there may be differences, family and close associates. So there may be differences in policies as to how remote those contacts could be before the conflict of interest rules for your organization kick in. Records and documents, ensure that you have copies and use these during the interview. Be prepared at the time you walk in with that information. Other available evidence. You know, the primary evidence gathering is going to be, in most cases, through the interview. But don't overlook cameras, cell phones, emails, and things of that nature as far as providing relevant information on your investigation. Also understand what your employee rights are. Review the policy regarding the rights of employees during the internal inquiry. This may also differ from company to company. If somebody does not provide or refuses to provide themselves for an interview, is this considered insubordination? If it is, are you permitted to talk to that person about the concept that their failure to discuss something with you is insubordinate? Substantive interviews of members of unions may result in union representation, and union representatives may have the right to take independent notes or record the meeting. This also may become a decision point with you as to whether or not you're going to go through with the interview in case where there is union representation. Anticipate problems. You may need to involve legal counsel, security, translators, union representation. Actually, the fewer people in a room conducting an interview, the better. But sometimes it's necessary to have these other people involved. Confidentiality. Once again, you protect the identities of those who request confidentiality. You try to protect them from improper dissemination of unsubstantiated information, or in fact, you want to protect them from dissemination of any information that's gathered in the course of the investigation. And of course, we need to protect the privacy of employees and members of the public. Outline your interview. It's always a good idea before you sit down and talk to somebody that you have in front of you a rough outline of questions and areas to be touched upon. There are 3 bullets in here that I'll focus on because while we talk about having an appropriate outline, we also want you to ensure that you are flexible in your approach to that. So the 3rd bullet about being flexible and permit development of leads that might arise. The notion that rigid adherence to an outline will seriously limit flexibility, and that your list of questions will be and reflect as an aid only, and not as a substitute for original questioning. Okay, moving on to slide 23, the location and environment of the interview. Really important. Choose surroundings that will facilitate the discussion. Conduct interviews in person and in private and one at a time. And as I said before, the fewer people in the room, the better. Avoid interference with work. Settings should be non-threatening and not too confined. Sensitive interviews have 2 people one to witness. And what do I mean by sensitive? If there's a possibility that the individual may engage in some self-incriminating statements, or the person may turn out to be a source that can provide good information for your investigation, or the subject matter itself is sensitive. For instance, in a sexual harassment case. Don't encroach on a person's personal space unless it's an interrogation. Then it's okay, but I'll caution you also to use that judiciously. You don't want to be acting in a threatening way. Avoid barriers between yourself and the interviewee, and that's a way that we set up the room. Try to be as open and as possible. A second investigator should sit away to avoid distraction. And one will do the questioning, the other will be taking notes. Schedule your interviews as soon as possible. Probably logically order the interviews to build the case. You want to go with the victim first. Generally, we start at the bottom and work our way up as far as logically ordering the interviews, or what I mean by up is to the person that you might suspect to be culpable. It's essential to obtain needed information before memory fails or is influenced. You know, memory can last for quite a while, but a person may be influenced rather quickly. So the notion as to being influenced also begs for some quick action on conducting these interviews. Allow sufficient time to complete the interview without interruption, and it's best to interview the person away from workspace. Initiating interviews at slide 25. Most people will be nervous, innocent or not, so identify those in the room participating in the interview, explain who you are and why you're doing this interview. The purpose of the interview is simply to gather the facts. Begin by establishing some sort of rapport. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Note that the interview is confidential. Make no threats or offer opinions. And if a person's attorney is present, have your own present, usually somebody from your general counsel's office. Demeanor is going to be important. On slide 26, demeanor is important to the outcome of the interview. Your demeanor, obviously. Appearing competent and professional encourages confidence in the individual being interviewed. Your reputation for professionalism will precede you into that interview room. And not only will your reputation precede you, but if you're part of a group of investigators or a particular office, the professionalism of that entire office may also be important. If you go in professionally, it has the effect of reducing nervousness in innocent parties, increases nervousness in guilty ones. Let's move on to slide 27. Keep an open mind at all times and be prepared to develop responses. We all carry around preconceptions and filters to information. The more you can put those to the side and accept the information that's being provided without some interpretation, you'll have a much better impact on getting to the actual facts in the case. As Dick mentioned earlier, the questions are who, what, where, when, how, and why. There's always a follow-up question. Be prepared to identify those and ask them. Avoid charge terms like investigation. You know, you could use, this is a review, this is an audit, this is an inquiry. Investigation has a little harsher connotation. Routine investigative inquiries can be made with minimum disclosure information. We talked about that earlier. The more information that gets out, the more damage you could be doing to your own professionalism and to the integrity of the investigation. Established rapport is very important from the standpoint of eliciting the information, and what we're doing is we're separating information that an individual has from the individual himself. Communicate empathy, reduce anxiety, use a smile, use some humor, stroke a person's ego, all to get them to get the sense that you're just doing your job and gathering facts in connection with an official investigation. In initiating the interview process, begin with simple questions such as, tell me your name, your job, who your supervisor is, how long have you been here, where were you before, that type of thing. It permits them to get a certain background information out, and it also permits you to assess that person's behavior. Then you delve down into the more substantive questioning. Act openly and in a friendly manner. We're in slide 30. Maintain eye contact, and there are other indicators on here that we won't be going through individually. The questioning process: ask the question, you receive a response, you evaluate the response, you record the response. The only thing I can say additionally about evaluating the response, do that inside your head, don't verbalize it. Allowing the person to narrate the story is often a good way to begin. Open-ended questions are much better than getting, please tell me what you know about a particular situation is the appropriate way to start these types of inquiries. On slide 32, remain neutral, avoid preconceived notions. As I mentioned before, turn off the filters, allow persons to fully answer the questions, ask questions as needed to clarify. This is not a race. Types of questions, this is important, and I started to hint at it before on slide 33. Types of questions to avoid: leading questions. It's used to clarify an answer, but don't use it use the open-ended questions as opposed to the leading questions. Leading questions are questions that are designed to get a yes or no response at the end. You want people to relate in their own words what happened. The types of questions to use, and we mentioned this earlier, so I'm not going to go through this again, but they're outlined here in slide 34.
On slide 35, we begin to deal with the issue of how much credibility do you give to somebody you're talking to? I mean, are they, for whatever reason, being open and honest with you? Are they holding back? Or are they being deceptive? So the whole idea is to not only listen to what people are saying, but also look at them. In fact, professional investigators know that more information is communicated through nonverbal communication than is through verbal communication. So you really need to recognize, analyze nonverbal communication. Watch what a person does, both vocal, their pitch, their stress, their tone, their pauses, their facial expressions and gestures, and are they more spontaneous? If they are, they're more reliable, that sort of thing. We're going to kind of give you just a taste of this whole area to give you an idea as to what to look for. It takes a little bit of training to get really on top of it. But, there's a lot of different nonverbal signals that would tell you that you may have somebody who is not being really truly open or honest with you in their answers. Little or no eye contact, or maybe too much direct eye contact. Looking up and down, or the big thing is looking up and to the left, is usually a sign that somebody is not telling the truth. Rigid posture could be a clue that somebody is holding back. Closed posture, that's like arms closed and folded in front of them. It's a hostile, closed posture. That's a signal. Grooming gestures, especially women. Women, touching their hair or adjusting their clothes or things of that sort is a common sign that they're uncomfortable with what's going on and they may be holding back. Now, that same goes for rubbing their nose or covering parts of their face. If there's no frontal alignment of the body, people are turning away, like they don't want to be there, or they're blushing or excessive yawning. Women have a tendency to want to put objects in front of them, particularly purses, when they don't feel comfortable. They want a barrier to the questioner. Verbal behavior are things like the person asked to have the question repeated, even simple ones, or provides non-answers or over-specific answers. They seem to have selective memory. They seem overly polite. Or they use the thing like, I did not do it instead of I didn't do it. Things of that sort. They're too assertive. They use a longer answer than necessary to answer a question. They speak in a monotone voice or garbled words. And a monotone voice because they're trying to control what they're going to be saying, or they garble words because they really don't want you to hear what they have to say. Or they give an answer that's really not directly related to the question, or they try to change the subject or move in a different direction. And in cases of deception, that it's kind of ironic, but women seem to turn more verbal when lying, whereas men become less verbal. Body language. Here's a bunch of body language photos of people that are giving indications of maybe not being truthful. The one on the lower left, I think we recognize. I did not have sex with that woman, says the president. And every investigator in the country that was a professional knew that there was something wrong with that answer when President Clinton said that on television. That goes back to these kind of clues that can give you an idea as to what kind of person you're dealing with. Here's a simple thing of body language that illustrates a couple of points. This is a police situation where you can see that in the picture on the left, the person is trying to cover part of their face, and then the picture on the right, that they folded their arms and they're turning away. Well, the next question is, what do you do when you encounter somebody you think is lying? One of the things that you do is you continue to go over the story again and have them clarify where they may have jumped over things or became overly vague or they drift off in the wrong direction, have them go back over the points, identify the things that can be independently verified and challenged. Because you want to know if they're lying, let me see if I can figure out a way in which I can determine whether that in fact is the case. Don't let the person wander from the subject. They have a tendency to want to draw you away from the discussion, so keep them back on the question. And ask questions regarding details or discrepancies. Point out the discrepancies to the person so that they know that you're not being fooled. And then look for changes in tone and demeanor, because that generally also is an indication that an individual is beginning to get uncomfortable and they're trying to avoid cooperating. In closing off any interview of any type, whether it's with a debriefing of a complainant or it's a witness interview or even in a subject interview, make a deliberate effort to continue to have some sort of rapport with the individual, even if they are the subject and they are hostile. And then also talk about, make a specific agreement about, well, if we need to contact you to get some clarification, how do we go about doing it, that sort of thing. And then obtain any additional data that might be necessary to be able to recontact that party is important. Now, for verification summary, and Emma mentioned this earlier, and that is you have to be doing a lot of juggling in your head to assess what is going on, to identify things that you have a problem with, things that you need to come back to, and so on. But also what it is here is when you are basically looking back on what happened during the interview, you want to kind of mentally rearrange the information so it's in a more logical order so you can determine whether it flows the way you want it to be. You want to summarize the important details in a proper sequence. You want to be able to verify or correct whatever information that you've gotten during the course of the interview process. And you also want to develop other sorts of information. For example, if somebody raises somebody up where somebody else could have had information about, that's another witness you may want to talk to, or there may be a record you can go to that will help verify what the person says or to show that they did not give the accurate information. Sometimes you can use signed statements with individuals if you really want to lock them in on their statement. I put that little thing about the LC. If you're going to be doing that, though, suggest that you coordinate the use and format with your legal counsel. And then also is one of the things that in your closing on an interview is always ended up with some sort of question catch-all question to draw out the interviewee on anything that may have happened during the course of it. Have you got anything that you think you want to add, or is there some questions that I should have asked and I didn't? That sort of thing. It's also very critical to take notes, but this is something where it's an art unto itself. If you're a federal agent, you will almost always have two agents conducting critical investigations. For an internal investigation, that is a pretty expensive process, and it's not usually open. It's always nice to have, as Emma pointed out, you have two agents or two investigators doing an interview. One's conducting the interview, the one's off to the side taking notes and watching behavior. That really makes a really good situation, and at the end, that other person can open up questions, and that's a really good way to do that. The fact is, in most cases, you're not going to have that luxury. Therefore, what it means is that when you sit down with somebody, you've got to be careful that you're not going to draw their attention to the fact that you're note-taking. A lot of times, for example, attorneys like to have their laptop open and sort of be typing out what the person says. It almost looks like a transcript, then makes people very nervous. The better approach would be if you can sit there and casually take cryptic notes for yourself during the course of the interview, and one that's not obvious that you're writing down a transcript. And as Emil said before, maintaining eye contact as much as possible with the person is important, which means that you don't want to take your eye off the person to write a paragraph of information that during the course of the interview, because you lose that eye contact, you can lose an awful lot in terms of the rapport that you built with the individual, and also with the flow of the interview itself. You also have to be organized, though nothing worse than right in the middle of an interview to be shuffling papers looking for some document you think would help you. You should have had that set up in advance. You want to have things very much organized. Do not do that kind of stuff. Also take enough of notes, even if they're cryptic, to prepare a proper, accurate report later, which means later is when that person leaves a room, you immediately go back to your cryptic notes and fill out the information. The cryptic notes basically are ones to remind you what was said. Then you can fill in the information at that time outside the presence of the person that you've interviewed. So immediately after the interview, you should be sitting down and doing that sort of thing.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the end product of this process. The job, of course, isn't over until the paperwork is done. In your investigative report, you must include all relevant aspects of the inquiry, and it must be presented in a thorough, accurate, objective, timely, understandable, and logically organized manner. One of the more important aspects on the next slide, 45, effective investigative reporting, is to provide a verbal briefing to your audience, usually maybe the general counsel or somebody in HR or whoever you're doing this for, and lay out the results of your investigation. In doing this, you might draw out questions that you may have already answered, but you may not have thought were important for a final report, and it will help you put together a report in a quicker and more user-friendly fashion for the person who's going to be receiving it. Write the report under the assumption that it may go outside to an outside party, and that is regardless of whether or not it's attorney work product or attorney-client privilege. These types of things get argued in court, and you never really know whether or not it's going to be end up being protected. There may be things that we need to put on the report, including attorney work product, but that's going to be driven by the client. The general guidelines for the report: just report the facts fairly. The evidence will speak for themselves. Write objectively and factually. Don't comment. If you're going to provide a commentary, do it orally. Leave it out of your investigative report. Moving on to slide 47. Don't include your personal opinions in the report. This actually may end up diminishing the credibility of the report. Use quotes carefully. Make sure that they correspond to whatever text you are relying on. Let's move to slide 48, accuracy of reports, and this really gets to what we've been talking about all along. These reports are going to be the basis for administrative or legal actions, and accuracy is going to be absolutely critical. Avoid using slang and technical terms. It's got to be a report that somebody without knowledge of the facts or any knowledge of the facts can pick up and understand. For slide 49, just ensure that the report is complete. All statements of material facts should be supported by the evidence. If there is all defenses, representations raised by the subject must be addressed. Anything that's mitigating in order to provide a fair and balanced report has to be included in the report that you provide. As far as report quality, we talked about these earlier. Complete, accurate, objective, timely, understandable, logically organized are important.
When you're writing a report, here's some tips. Use the active voice. Avoid it is, there are constructions. Use verbs instead of nouns for action. Organize your related ideas together and separate thoughts. You're not really writing a great American novel here. You're writing something that's going to be understandable. So you can break down paragraphs into shorter pieces and then separate them. Even if you're writing a novel, you might want to have it in a single paragraph, break it down. Write shorter sentences. Under all circumstances, any circumstances, avoid any jargon. Jargon can spoil your report. And there's a tendency with all the television shows and everything else to kind of pick up jargon from various law enforcement related shows, and that's not good. Limit acronyms and abbreviations is really also an important tip. Again, emphasizing this: short, declarative sentences. Limit sentences to about 20, 25 words. Each sentence should have one idea in it. Avoid long compound sentences. Use 2 short sentences rather than 1 long one. Use numbers or bullets to separate thoughts. Avoid wordy phrases. Deemed necessary to. It has been shown that. It has been found that. It is recognized that. It's worth noting that. You must remember that. Evidence suggests that. There's a whole host of things that you just don't need to have in your report. Again, shorter paragraphs. Limit paragraphs to 2 to 4 sentences. Use 2 paragraphs instead of 1, each with a separate idea. Use other techniques to convey ideas more clearly, sometimes like using bullet points, that sort of thing. An important thing is pretty obvious, but I got to tell you that we've reviewed a lot of reports where we kind of shudder. Yeah, I use spell check, but spell check is not good enough by itself because spell check can actually pass words that really are inappropriate to a sentence. It's better to use a cold reader, somebody who is not part of actually doing the investigation, who can read your report and make comment on it. And also another thing that's very, very good is that don't type up the report and immediately run down the hall and give it to somebody. Let it rest for a while. Set it aside and then reread it. Also, another technique is to read it aloud slowly, 1 word at a time. I have to do this all the time because I'm really sometimes get going so fast that then I don't realize what I've written, and then I read it aloud to myself or to the room, 1 word at a time. I'm shocked at what I actually wrote. Use a cover page. Outline the draft. Look carefully for the usual errors and pay special attention to small mistakes. A small mistake is really important to avoid because a small mistake may suggest to the reader or to some other third party that there may be larger mistakes in the content of the investigation report. Report organization.
I just wanted to double down on what you said also, Dick, about proofreading. I am my own worst proofreader, and we end up reading for concepts and thoughts rather than for punctuation and grammar. The report organization, we've identified 14 areas to think about. I think we're running pretty close on time, so I'm not going to go through them all. But I think these are helpful ideas. It depends on the size of the report. It depends on the organization and their own style manual. but I would take a look at the slide for particular areas to think about in putting together a report.
This last one's just a commercial message, although I don't personally benefit from it. There's a book out that I wrote that conducting internal investigations in healthcare organizations, about 300 pages long, has a whole host of templates. If you're interested, that can be found at aishealth.org or .com. So at that point, we wanted to leave, as Emil said, time for questions. Most of the time, that what we find when we do something like this is that we touch on subjects that excite interest for clarification or elaboration. So we want to stop now and see if we can respond to any such questions that may have come from you that participate in this program.
Actually, Dick, this is Lynn with Wolters Kluwer. I'm going to first, before we get into questions, and it's a good time for folks that have questions to be able to submit them using the menu bar. I'm going to spend just a quick 2 or 3 minutes talking about our ComplyTrack solution and how it can be utilized in regard to the investigations you're conducting as an organization. And then I'm going to turn it over to Kelly, and he'll lead us through the questions that you have. We'll have time to go through a handful of those. So I'm just going to talk about quickly 2 pieces of our ComplyTrack solution that tie into what Dick and Emil were talking about today. The first being our Activity and Event Manager, which is a tracking tool. It's designed to assist organizations in tracking all of the things that you do and you deal with on a daily basis. And those could be non-issue related, so education, auditing, monitoring, meetings, the different things that occur throughout your organization periodically. But its main use among a lot of our clients is using it to capture the issues and incidents that you're confronted with and being able to manage all of the things that you're doing in following up on it. So when there are issues and there are incidents and you do have to conduct investigations, having a place to capture all of the things that you're doing over the course of the investigation, having the ability to tie in through the system all of the different departments and individuals that would be involved in that process. These very rarely just involve one department. It usually spans different departments or functions. So having a central location that everybody can come into and document their pieces and be able to see what other members of the team have been doing, the ability to, from a project project management perspective, create and assign tasks that can be assigned to the appropriate individuals or groups to make sure that everybody is aware of what they're responsible for. Having the ability to tie together supporting documentation, so when you have interview notes, when you have a report of findings, when you have evidence that you need to tie to the activities that you're conducting, that there is a place for you to do that. Being able to set up email reminders so that you can manage your deadlines. So if your policies dictate that you need to be following up within a certain amount of time, that you can make sure that you're sticking to those requirements. And being able to capture then all of the things that are occurring over the course of the investigation, the steps that are being taken, who's overseeing those steps, when those steps were taken, when this investigation is concluded and final determination is made, when is this resolved? How is this resolved? And being able to capture the details of that resolution. And of course, being able to generate reports on everything you're doing in the system. And that can involve analytics, tracking and trending the types of issues that you're seeing, generating reports that are also going to show you how long it's taking you to fully resolve these issues that are being captured within the application. So that's the first piece that I wanted to highlight. And then the other piece that I just want to take a quick second to touch on is our document manager. And the document manager is giving you a place where you can capture all of the policies and procedures that your organization has, as well as any other documents that you might want in a central repository, so that you have a place where those can be built into the system. And being able to capture then all of your policies and procedures related to your investigations, like we saw with one of those early slides that Dick and Emil had up. So everything you're doing related to investigations. Those could be forms that you have, policies and procedures that you have developed, letter templates, whatever it might be. Having that central repository to be able to create them, manage the approval process for them, and maintain them over time. So just a quick overview of those pieces. And if you'd like to get any more information or see a demonstration that takes longer than 3 or 4 minutes, then a rep will be in contact with you to have that conversation. But at this point, I will turn it over to Kelly to take you through some of the questions that have come in.
Thanks very much, Lynn. We do have quite a few questions that have come in. And obviously, with the time constraint here, some of them won't get answered, but we will reply to you via email. First question we have is from Charlene, and it's what if the employee asked to record the interview, have an attorney present, or have a coworker present? We currently don't allow this at this time for internal investigations. Is this okay? And then we've had quite a few other questions saying, is it okay to record or videotape an interview?
I would say generally the answer is to stick with your internal policy, and if your policy is to not record those or videotape them, I would at least because once you start down that road, you're going to have to do it for just about anybody who asks.
Yeah, that's right. The best practice is to say no. If you're going to be talking to a witness, why do they need to have it? If you're really talking about a subject interview and they want to record it for their own record or have an attorney present, remember we started off by saying if there is an attorney present with the witness, then you must have your attorney present. You've changed the whole nature of the relationship there. Otherwise, what it is that employees are obligated to cooperate with an internal investigation. If there were a witness and you represent management and you're asking some questions on it, if they're not going to be cooperative, they got a problem. They got a problem. You have a problem, but they have a problem too. And if they say, I want to have it recorded, you say, why do you want it recorded? And just say, that's not our practice to do that. And quite frankly, in most cases, I would avoid any interview that says they want to record it and have it noted that this person was not fully cooperative and seemed to feel that they had to have some defensive measures to protect them. I don't like the idea that they record because, as Emil says, as soon as you go down that path, you're going to have everybody wanting the same thing, and you're going to have a big mess on hand. So best practice is not do that. If they do have an attorney present, you have to have an attorney present. And, of course, then that changes the whole character of it. Because one of the frustrations that Emil and I have about doing a program like this is that there's so much to talk about and so little time. It's just sort of like we feel like a racehorse is being forced to walk. You know, it's really hard. But there's an awful lot of information out here on that. But our best guess is what we just said about having it recorded or having somebody else present. Now, remember that Emil said that one of the things is that you may have a union contract that says that they have the right to do that. That's why he said that you should check that first to see what your internal policies are with regards to it.
Great. Thank you very much. Another question is a great question from Cindy. What do you mean by interrogation, and why is it okay to encroach on personal space? And is that just getting closer to the person or actually yelling or touching them?
Under no circumstances are you ever disrespectful to a person. They can be your worst enemy or anything else. But when you're conducting an interview, you have to keep your professional demeanor. What Emil, I shouldn't answer your question, Emil, but basically what he's supposed to say is that people have a body, sort of their personal space is sort of like with 3 feet. You get closer than 3 feet, you're beginning to encroach on their personal space, and they get nervous. An interrogation basically is when is contrasted with the other two types of interviews that were mentioned. A debriefing of a complainant. The person's coming in and want to tell you a story. You're writing that down. That's fine. And the witnesses are neutral. They're not party to anything. They just may have seen something or they may know something. You're asking questions. But if the investigation gets around where somebody may be a potential wrongdoer and the finger is pointing to them as that they may have violated something, then they are going to be more hostile. When they become more hostile, you're going to have to be more direct. Remember, Aiden was saying, they always start off by saying, tell your story. And that's fine for a witness to say, where were you at the time this happened? Why don't you tell us what you saw? And that's open-ended questions like that. When you get to a subject interview, they're not going to want to be open to tell you anything. Then all of a sudden it reverses, and that's what Emil was saying. You go from open-ended questions to closed-ended questions. You start doing what you would not do in a witness interview. You start asking questions, yes, no answers, to nail somebody down specifically as to the facts as they knew them.
Yeah, and that's not something that you would do in all cases, even in a subject interview. It really depends on how you are evaluating their truthfulness, and it may take and I would avoid impinging on personal space, but it may take more of a turn in terms of the your voice, your posturing, your that type of thing, rather than infringing on that personal space.
When you start beginning to question the answers that they're providing, you're now on a different plane with them. You're basically saying, I'm having trouble believing you. Why are you telling me this when the facts don't seem to support it? Or why are you inconsistent with what you're doing? That's no longer a totally cooperative kind of a exchange of information that you would have with a witness. You're now talking to somebody where you really are trying to pin them down, and that's the big difference.
Perfect. That's great. We're butting up against our 2 o'clock time frame here, and I want to thank everyone once again for joining us today. As I mentioned before, the questions we didn't get to, we will be responding via email. I hope you have a great rest of the day, as this concludes our presentation on conducting internal compliance investigations.